Welcome those who are just joining us now. We'll just wait for others to join as people are coming in. My guess is probably some kind of tired people out there who've been either up all night or woke up very early. And we'll get a kind of look at what's been happening at the moment. So normally when strange things happen, one of my neighbours stands on his roof, and I can currently see him standing on his roof at the moment, looking out at the world and drinking his coffee. So I can see that.
Nice day for it.
What's that, Will?
A nice day for it, I said.
Yeah, absolutely. He sometimes does yoga poses as well. Which is rather odd, but yeah. So welcome to those people who are just joining us after a strange day. I'm sure some of you have been up all night, and some of you have just woken up. Will, did you stay up all night, or?
No, I sort of impatiently started watching the TV from kind of 10 p.m. onwards, even though there was nothing really going on till about 1, and then I turned in at about sort of 2:30ish or something. I mean Florida was pretty much confirmed by then, but yeah, there was still very little that was clear. And then I turned on my phone at sort of 5:30 or something again, and there was still very little that was clear. So
yeah, exactly. So I think it's like lack of clarity is one of the big themes here, right? which will keep on going. So I guess it's some clarity around we're unclear. Okay, so a few people will join us now. Still, we have Caroline who's just joined us. So maybe as people will join, I'll just begin by introducing William Davies. So we're very lucky to have him with us today. In some ways, is kind of the perfect person in a strange way. Will is he's kind of a political theorist, I guess is probably the best way to put it. Political theorist and economic sociologist, who started out looking at kind of I guess the changing nature of British politics, the rise of Neo-liberalism, and then got interested in questions around happiness. He wrote a fantastic book called The Happiness Industries, which came out some years ago. And then after that, a few years later, kind of spurred by the Brexit referendum and the election of Trump won, the first time around, he wrote a book called Nervous State, which explores many of these questions, which we're kind of facing again today, which is the kind of changing nature of politics in the West. He's also a prolific commentator in the New York Times, London Review of Books, Guardian, and various other places on politics and changing nature of politics. And instead of kind of getting into the nitty-gritty of, the mechanisms of American politics and the day-by-day ticking by events, he tends to point out a big picture, and often is very good at connecting broader changes in politics with changes in technology and other kind of things. So that's why we wanted to have Will along to talk with us today. Many of you will know his work. So I wanted to begin by asking Will, so I'll just stop sharing the screen now. What do we know now? So where are we?
Yeah, thanks, Andre, and thanks for having me along and for that kind introduction. As I'm not a US politics expert as such, but I have spent some of the last sort of, I suppose, whatever, 12 hours or so trying to work out what's going on. Most of you will be aware that at the moment, I think it looks that if the votes are counted in their entirety in states of Michigan and Wisconsin, it looks very odds on that Joe Biden will win the presidential election. As I'm sure you've all seen, some of the potential turning points in the night didn't come to pass in Florida, in Georgia, and not in Texas, which could have happened. Some people thought Arizona obviously was a big victory for Biden about sort of 4 or 5 hours ago. But really, it's a case of the fact that I've heard that about 75% of the postal votes that are being counted in the Midwest are Democrats. Votes for Biden, and that means that if those votes do get counted in their entirety over the next sort of however many days it takes, that it's almost a sort of, I'd say it's extremely likely that that Biden then wins those states and doesn't have to win Pennsylvania in order to win the Electoral College. So, I mean, that, as I'm sure most of you are aware, that's kind of sort of statistically where we are. But then, of course, Trump has already kind of declared victory, and you know, this is obviously the great unknown that many people have been waiting for over the recent months. And some of you will have read there's been some great journalism in the Atlantic and the Boston Review and so on, of kind of what sort of scenarios could arise where Biden wins the Electoral College, but is not able to sort of oust Trump from the White House in certain respects. And, you know, this remains the question. I mean, the piece in the Atlantic, and that was it by David Frum? I can't remember, but we're pointing out that the US Constitution has this kind of, you know, extraordinary sort of pivotal aspect at its heart, that there is, he used the term performativity, that for any social scholars and social studies of finance out there will be familiar with what this term means, but effectively the moment where the sitting president says, I concede, is a very important moment for the transition of power, and throughout the 240-year history of the United States, it's always been relied upon for this moment. And Al Gore kind of conceded too early in 2000, but that moment where you say, I concede, and what happens when you have a sort of someone who is psychologically incapable of ever saying the words I concede, how does the Constitution manage that? So we will find that out over the coming days and weeks.
So today, I mean, just on this theme, Will, today the phrase which I picked up before I began my teaching today was when Trump appeared, and he said, we were getting ready to win the election. Frankly, we've already won, or something like that. So frankly, we did win the election. So it's almost like this performativity in a sense, right?
Sure, that's right. And I mean, he said this in 2016, and he said that he would accept the result if he won. And he said in 2020, you know, that he will accept the result if he wins, and he's not going to lose. And then he said things like, you know, we'll never know who's really won. So I mean, ultimately, the you know, Trump is sort of one way or the other has long been looking for a way of not allowing all of the votes to be taken into account, either through voter suppression strategies or stopping the counting, or you know, or somehow sort of casting sufficient doubt on votes that are counted in other respects. So I mean, that's obviously what he's been aiming for a while, which is that this is a minoritarian project that the Republicans are now sort of prosecuting, which is sort of how to hold on to forms of power where not only do they represent a minority in society, but they also represent a minority of the popular vote, and they may also end up representing a potential minority of the Electoral College, but one way or the other still try to hold on either to well, it would be a coup if he was to hold on to the presidency in spite of that, but obviously they have achieved the majority on the Supreme Court in the last few weeks. That is the sort of real prize for conservatives. So that minoritarian project that the Republican Party has been engaged in for some time has, you know, is still kind of functioning in some respects, and it doesn't necessarily need, you know, if Trump is to somehow be ousted from the White House, then of course it survives in the form of the conservative Supreme Court potentially for decades.
Okay, so I should just note that if you have any questions as we're going, people have any questions as we're going along, pop them into the Q&A, or comments, pop them into the chat function. So are there any points of comparison historically in recent elections?
Well, I mean, obviously there's 2000, and I mean, most of people here will be familiar with what happened in 2000 and may have vivid memories of it themselves. And that was where, for myself anyway, I had no idea until the 2000 election that, you know, as I'm sure everybody knows, was, you know, that Gore conceded quite soon after the election night itself, because it looked like he'd lost Florida, but then there were all of these sort of disputes and uncounted votes and so on, and so he withdrew his concession, and then eventually kind of gave it again after the Supreme Court ordered the vote count to stop some weeks later, or the recounts to stop, and it was the election of the hanging chads, as many of you will remember. But what was so different then, I suppose, and that, I mean, what I think was telling about that election was that to those of us who are from outside of the United States, I didn't realize how significant the media is to election results. When do you call the election result? And I mean, this obviously things changed after 2000, and CNN and others became much more cautious about calling results. But the idea that the media is an integral part of your democratic system in that way is sort of extraordinary, as is the sheer incompetence and technological kind of naivety and sort of Luddite nature of certain well, not just Luddite nature, but sort of active voter repression strategies of how the physical technique of casting a vote is quite so poorly managed in so many areas of the United States, which of course is a voter suppression strategy. But this, I think, was a bit of a shock, really, because it hadn't really become a sort of matter of, it hadn't sort of disrupted the space of democracy to that extent. But what survived in 2000, while the technologies of from a sort of science studies perspective, the technologies were kind of sort of becoming sort of actively disrupting the state of affairs. But what allowed consensus to survive was obviously that Gore behaved in a, some would say, too civil fashion by sort of acting in the kind of broader interest of the Republic by offering these concessions. And what we obviously don't have now is that sense of one party is not possibly ever going to do that in a very straightforward fashion, but we have both parties implicitly or explicitly accusing the other one of a kind of type of fraudulent behavior. So when you combine a kind of technological incompetence with voter repression, with that sense that of effectively a sort of gradual sort of breaking into kind of open warfare, then it's really not clear that elections resolve things in the way that Democrats, people who are small d Democrats, hope elections put uncertainty to bed in certain respects. And it's not clear that elections can do that under these sorts of conditions. It might be that Biden ends up being the president, but the election doesn't perform that kind of moment of bringing uncertainty to an end, in a sense. It doesn't resolve a crisis in the sort of sense of that pragmatists are sort of interested in kind of how the moments of uncertainty get resolved into moments of clarity and consensus. And it's not clear that elections necessarily have that capacity in the United States at the moment. And in that sense, politics gets pushed into non-electoral spaces. And one of those spaces is the Supreme Court and the courts in general, where the disputes that go on amongst lawyers and amongst judges become one kind of arena of the political, and the other is the street, which becomes another arena of the political. And in that sense, I think that we're going to see, regardless of what happens, that politics will remain pushed into these other arenas, particularly given that Biden, he might be sort of legally and constitutionally the president, but it's not like he's almost a sort of, his status is to sort of stop Trump as much as anything else. So the kind of his broader sort of public and cultural legitimacy, I think, will not be particularly sort of strong. And I mean, that's often been a problem for, Obama faced a version of that problem, as did Clinton, where conservatives basically spend an entire presidency disputing the right of a Democrat president to govern. And I think Biden would have that not simply within Congress, but I think he'd have it all over the place.
So what happens when politics gets pushed into the courts and the streets? I mean, I know that there's these Supreme Court watchers who spend their whole life trying to figure these things out, but maybe you'd have some comments about what happens when politics gets pushed into the streets, perhaps.
Well, in the streets, I mean, of course, this is the fear is of sort of forms of street mobilization. So you have the fear of militia on the right, and then you have the fear that Trump has sort of basically built his whole campaign around, which is the fear of the protesters and Black Lives Matter movements in the streets. That this is the sort of the way Trump tried to frame the election was kind of strongman autocrat, or the masses in the street, effectively, which is a very kind of, this is a very sort of classical form of authoritarian trope in a way. It's either me or it's this kind of anarchy, and no doubt that succeeded for him in lots of areas and amongst lots of voters. But I think that it's not, and then as far as the legal institutions are concerned, I mean, I think the problem that American politics has got itself into is that the sort of holding institutions of the constitution, the constitutional institutions that would once have been expected to provide the kind of holding environment within which democracy and disagreement takes place, have become dragged into the arena, in the sense that the Supreme Court is so politicized now. The conservative argument would be this began on the left, that it began with, during the civil rights movement and Roe v. Wade in the 60s and 70s, and that this is a kind of a sort of revenge, in a way, that the Amy Coney Barrett appointment and that this is something the Liberals had the court for a certain number of decades, and now the Conservatives are going to get their get their chance. And this is a sort of a type of politics that, it makes me think of how Peter Sloterdijk talks about the politics of rage, that effectively that democracy and morality becomes not about the resolution of injustice, or the repayment of, or the settling of disagreement, or the kind of moving on from conflict through some kind of some sort of leveling up. And this is what someone like Martha Nussbaum, kind of in her writing about anger, talks about how, in some sense, justice has to offer an alternative to anger, because justice has to be a sort of a different way of a different form of repayment than sheer kind of retribution. But effectively, what happens once the courts themselves are treated in this kind of 3 decades for us, 3 decades for you, versus backs and forwards, is that you get a kind of an economy of rage in Sloterdijk's terms, where that everything is about repaying the injury that was done by one's opponents in the past, potentially in the quite distant past, which of course is what Trumpism is about: retribution for injuries to the white male that are perceived to have taken place over the previous kind of 40, 50 years. And I think that's, remains, I mean, that's not exclusively what the Trump voter now looks like, because we know that in this election, the Hispanic vote for Trump went up and so on. It's not just the sort of cliche of the angry white man. But I think that, this is the worry with where American politics is, that it's not really able to kind of resolve differences in any kind of short term, and that sort of conflicts are being played out over several decades, and that's partly to do with the position of the Supreme Court in relation to American politics.
So what do you think we're at this sort of moment where many of the kind of institutions are being kind of undermined. So what do you think is going to happen next? What do you see the potential roads as being of the kind of next steps? You mentioned that even if Trump wins, there could be Trumpism without Trump, potentially.
Yeah, well, obviously so the court remains an artifact of the Republican. It becomes, something that the central achievement of the Republican Party will be the Supreme Court that balance that was established under Trump. And if he goes, then many people have said that, as far as Mitch McConnell is concerned in Congress, getting Amy Coney Barrett onto the Supreme Court and getting the majority there is a much bigger prize than getting a second Trump term. So that remains the case. And these militia and these movements on the streets are not going to go away as far as that aspect of Trumpism is concerned. I think that, there is, I think, the question is whether, to what extent are political parties able to actually kind of capture and express the full range of interests and political demands that are at large in society, in American society. And so much of, rather a bit like what happened with the Conservative Party over the summer of 2019, where the Brexit kind of party was sort of absorbed into the Conservative Party through the confrontation with the Supreme Court and the Johnson leadership. The Republican Party seems able to kind of encompass far more of its right flank than perhaps the Democrat Party will be able to going forward. The Democrat Party has, I think we've lost Andre actually there, but the Democrat Party has, looks like it's managed to absorb a lot of the Sanders vote as part of a kind of anti-Trump movement, but I'm slightly distracted by the fact that Andre seems to have disappeared, you know, whether that he's just texting me. My internet is unstable. Back in a second. Just keep talking. Okay, so it's time to give a kind of monologue now. I think we're going to go to questions in a minute, but you know, yes, I think that one of the big questions here is, are elections in the United States actually able to sort of be to perform the kind of democratic function that is required of them, and are they able to actually kind of produce any forms of consensus or hegemony? I mean, if you compare, one thing which I was sort of looking at the electoral maps of yesteryear, and here's Andre again. Just saying, like, in terms of to what extent are elections in America able to generate anything that you might kind of call hegemony, or I mean, consensus is much too far off. But any kind of sense of a sort of a sense of a common sense or hegemony, or a sense of a kind of stable paradigm of government. If you look at Lyndon Johnson in 1964, I mean, the map is almost entirely blue, other than a couple of Republican states in the South. And then you look at Richard Nixon in 1972, and it's just the reverse. And that was a sort of, and equally you look at Reagan in 1984, and the entire map goes Republican. And that way in which American democracy is able to sort of produce these sorts of, that doesn't mean that there's no sort of dissensus or dissent. But I think that American elections now are sort of moments of the expression of powerful antipathies as much as anything else. And in this case, it was, Trump remains the person who expresses still a kind of anti-politics, anti-Washington DC sort of antipathy. And on this occasion, Biden was someone able to tap into an anti-Trump antipathy. I mean, that doesn't seem to me kind of, I'm not sure we have the theories of democracy or certainly that's not the current American system of democracy. It doesn't really seem to ever kind of resolve very much or enable anything very functional under those circumstances in the way that it might have done in the past.
So were you just responding to this question about whether the breakup of the US?
No,
no, you weren't. Okay, so I'll put it to you then. So Dominic Pates is asking us, what do you think about whether there's any realistic long-term prospect about the breakup of the United States, as there is with the UK independence referendum, Scottish independence?
Yeah, I mean, so what's the? I don't know. I'm not sure what the sort of theory is there, that what the South would secede or California would secede. I mean, obviously there's a sort of, I don't know exactly how it's imagined it might happen. So in the way that it's kind of quite clear how it would happen in the UK. I mean, I think that there is an interesting issue, which is that federal tax revenue continues to come heavily from strongly Democrat states such as California and New York and Massachusetts and these sorts of places. And there is a sort of, the extent to which you can sustain a kind of a sort of form of, a federal government in which there is such political disagreement and yet still a kind of fiscal integration in that way. I think that's a question. I mean, that's, after all, is partly what the limits on the European Union model is, that it's not seen that people would be willing, would to push the comparison a bit further, is Germany willing to contribute as much to the European Union fiscally as California does to the United States? I mean, that would be seen as being kind of, too much sort of political pressure on the whole project. And so there is that seems to me a kind of one of the tensions here. I mean, the idea of some sort of southern secession, I don't know if that's the hypothesis, but obviously the changing nature of the South is another sort of demographic story here, because a lot of people still think that Texas will eventually turn Democrat again, and which would obviously change the electoral map or the electoral college hugely. Yeah, I'm not sure where exactly the line would happen. I mean, you look at the places which remain most strongly Trump, and they are still kind of, Wyoming is the place that has the most strong Trump vote, and it tends to be that places, as they become more prosperous and obviously more urban, but particularly more prosperous, the Democrat Party is still the party of sort of kind of wealth-producing American capitalism, both on the East and West Coast and potentially in the South. And I mean, you look in 2016, I've got this stat in my book, Nervous States, somewhere, that, you know, if you did it county by county, Hillary Clinton's counties produce something like 65% of American GDP or something like that. So there is a sort of strange sense that economic contribution and political representation are completely out of kilter.
Mm. So one other theme which you frequently write about is the role of technology, in particular social media and real-time technologies, and the impact it has on sort of politics. Have you got any kind of reflections on what's happened tonight on that, about that?
I don't know. It's funny. No one's mentioned sort of Facebook or fake news or psychographic targeting yet. I don't know if that's going to come. Maybe that takes a while before people start to talk about that. Thank God no one's mentioned Putin either, because I mean, I'm not sure I had the stomach to go through that whole kind of debate again about, you know, who really kind of won this election. But maybe we've got all of that to look forward to over the next few weeks. I mean, so obviously, I'm sure the platforms and the targeted ads played a huge role. Whether the new rules that Facebook and others have imposed upon themselves, whether that has limited the worst examples of fake news and so on, I don't know at the moment. I'm sure people are looking into that.
How about?
Yeah.
So I was just going to ask. A few months ago, you wrote an article about WhatsApp. And we've recently seen these kind of wave of, in India and other places, of what's called the WhatsApp elections. Do you think this may have had an impact?
It may have done. I mean, I think, so it's interesting. So I had this article, this Guardian long read about WhatsApp, and I looked a bit into some of the kind of, you know, examples, because Brazil and India are the countries that both have had these nationalist leadership victories, and WhatsApp happens to be very powerful in both of them. I don't think as yet that, I mean, first of all, I don't think WhatsApp is as widespread in the United States as it is in some of Europe, and certainly not as in India, where it's a kind of very dominant platform. In Brazil, there's quite a lot of, I mean, borderline, I think, illegal sort of, you know, people get sort of spammed on WhatsApp through kind of, you know, people managing to sort of break into collecting numbers in some way or selling. And WhatsApp, I mean, it's a very sort of, you know, as I argue in the piece, it's a particularly problematic platform for democracy, because its central principle is privacy and encryption. And it also has this sort of peer-to-peer forwarding function that allows people to kind of, you know, you get a message, which was very damaging in things like coronavirus, with the fake news around treatments and so on, where you can just like send things on to, you know, 100 people very, very quickly from one group to another. So this kind of, these waves of fake news and so on, which take place. I haven't seen that's necessarily happening so much in the United States. I mean, the US has always had obviously a very lively talk radio kind of scene that has been very powerful on the right for a long time, and it's had Fox News that has been so powerful on the right since the late 90s. So in a sense, it's always had a culture that is quite similar to a kind of YouTuber sort of political culture, of these kind of fast talking kind of celebrity opinion formers who, you know, you can, once they sort of sow a meme of some kind, you know, whether it be a sort of, you know, Pizzagate kind of conspiracy theory or something else, those people have become the kind of nodes in a kind of information ecology. You know, one of the best books on that I really recommend is Network Propaganda, which is by Jocko Benkler and a series of co-authors whose names are not, I don't remember. I know Benkler's work through his stuff on networks, but Network Propaganda is all about, you know, they did a kind of big data analysis, network analysis of how information traveled around the media ecologies of the left and the right in the 2016 election. And, you know, websites like Breitbart and others were absolutely pivotal for the circulation of conspiracy. They basically broker conspiracy theories from the crazy end of YouTube and Facebook towards fake Fox News, so that Fox News starts to talk about something like Pizzagate and QAnon, not because they're necessarily saying it's true, but because it's already in kind of being discussed. And that's, you know, this is the sort of some of the crazy aspects of American democracy that, you know, de Tocqueville was sort of noticing back in the early 19th century, of like just this addiction to sort of chatter, really, of like, which, I mean, social media sort of accelerates it, but I think it also predates social media.
Okay, so I think we need to leave it there with these two last thoughts about the first influence. Social media influences were right-wing radio shock jocks, a classic Will insight. And the second thing is kind of returning us to Tocqueville and sort of asking, has much actually changed? Before I thank Will, I'd just like to draw attention to upcoming events. So next week we have Kugali, an event about a black comic, which is produced by some alums from City University, I think, and they're building a business around this at the moment. And then second week, 2 weeks time, we have Jill Rutter, who's one of the sort of better commentators on Brexit, sort of knows the ins and outs of the government, coming to talk to us about Brexit. So let's just thank Will for his great contribution. Thanks very much, Will. And I hope everyone gets a little bit of a rest if they've been up all night, or follows the news if they haven't. So thanks very much, Will, and goodbye, everyone.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thanks.